Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 381. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Just remember to share the show. I have a really important episode for everyone today. There is a brand new article out by Seymour Hersh. He says he has a high-placed source saying that the U.S. was behind the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline, and we'll get into that. So just again, be sure to share the show. You can find it on Twitter. I always post the show on my account at @KyleAnzalone_. You can find it on YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, and you can find the show on the blog at antiwar.com. Here we go. All right. This article from Seymour Hersh was posted. I think he just started his Substack, and he posted this article this morning. It's titled, How America Took Out the Nord Stream Pipeline. It's probably a 20 to 30 minute read, but I recommend going through and reading it for yourself because he does just have one source here. And so there's one person who gives him a lot of details. Now, he's able to corroborate a lot of what his source tells him by lining up other events that have taken place over the past year. But at the same time, you should definitely read it for yourself to know what kind of details are really confirmed here and what kind of details are really just coming from a U.S. government source. And while Seymour Hersh is definitely the kind of journalist who can report like this and who I feel comfortable discussing this article, at the same time, this is there's always a possibility that things can be, made to look one way by this certain one individual. So definitely check out the article for yourself. But Hersh lays out how the U.S., how there's this, kind of elite cabal of foreign policy teams, Victoria Nuland, Jade Sullivan, representatives from the CIA, and others who all got together prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and were trying to decide what to do about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and also the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, seeing how this was a way that Russia made a lot of money. And so one of the things they came up with was destroying the pipelines. And there was a lot of concern about this. Hersh lays out in his article, they're very concerned that this is an act of war against Russia. This is a Russia majority-owned pipeline. The Russian government owns 51%. However, 4 other European nations do own large shares of the pipeline, including Germany and I believe France. And so this, this is a major act. This is, I think, especially given that the U.S. isn't at war with Russia in certainly any official capacity, but, this was being planned before even the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is more or less an act of terrorism and not an act of war. So, this was, call it ecological terrorism, terrorism against infrastructure. This created a massive methane gas leak, one of the largest that's ever occurred. And so, for a government that claims to be concerned about the environment, blowing up pipelines, that seems to be, quite an opposite kind of thing to do. And yet, that's ultimately, according to Hersh, what they pulled off here. So they found out a way to get as few people involved as possible in this to make sure that it didn't come out that the Americans were behind it because of what I just laid out. I really think that if we go into some hearings and, Congress is at all interested. And I can't imagine that Congress is really interested in investigating here. As Hersh points out in his articles, one of the central figures here is Ted Cruz, who, is a Republican, but really, really wants the Nord Stream pipeline destroyed and not turned on because of, the interest of his donors and his constituents in Texas who, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline was good business for them. So, but at the same time, if we really look at this is criminal. And I do think there's room to impeach Biden over this and, remove and charge other members of his administration over the planning and carrying out this, again, destruction of civilian infrastructure that was half owned, 49% owned by European companies. And so, to cut down on the number of people that knew this, they didn't make it a top secret mission where they were using special forces. They actually went to the Navy's Driving and Salvage Center, and this is a more obscure kind of training program, and they found divers there with the Navy to carry this out because it carried it out through the Navy rather than through special forces. They don't have to inform Congress. And so they worked particularly with Norway, the Norwegians, to carry this out. It seems that Norway provided a lot of the logistical support needed, picking the site that this was going to occur, what kind of detonation devices were going to be used, how to make sure that Russia doesn't have the ability to detect what's going on here. So one of the kind of the way this worked is that the divers used the cover of war games, which is, probably another issue that kind of confirms a lot of Russia's concerns, which, they were saying for a long time prior to the invasion of Ukraine that all these Western war games are a real problem for Russia because they're being used as cover to funnel weapons into Ukraine and to do other nefarious things targeting Russia. And here's another example of that where, they use the cover of military drills to actually carry out a military operation. So it's the Baltops 22 war games, and during those war games, they had divers swim down about 260 feet and place mines covered in concrete. And these mines were apparently set off by a sonar device, and Seymour Hersh actually has the date and the kind of plane. It's a Norwegian Poseidon 8 plane that actually dropped the sonar device to eventually detonate those C4 devices on 3 of the 4 Nord Stream pipelines. There is still one pipeline that hasn't been destroyed, but this would, reduce the capacity even of the pre-war when only the Nord Stream 1 pipeline was operating if the remaining pipelines could be reactivated. So this is big. I, on the show, as my readers know, I have been very skeptical of the claims that the U.S. was behind this attack. For the most part, it's just been, kind of circumstantial. And Seymour Hersh has a lot of this in his article. Biden and Victoria Nuland saying that they would like to see the Nord Stream pipeline destroyed before it was destroyed. Then after the destruction, you have Sullivan and Victoria Nuland, high-ranking members of the administration and people apparently involved, according to Hersh, in the planning of this event, all their bragging about it publicly that this was going to happen. And so, this is a part of Hersh's story and does help to make sense of it. But at the same time, Victoria Nuland saying that she's glad the Nord Stream pipeline was destroyed or that the U.S. could destroy the Nord Stream pipeline, didn't seem like something that the White House would actually move forward with. And if you read the article and just about everything else about the Joe Biden presidency, especially when it comes to foreign policy, he really doesn't seem to be able to take a position. He has hots in his administration and uber hots. And so, Victoria Nuland and Jade Sullivan and Anthony Blinken and Lloyd Austin are often arguing with, maybe the CIA director, William Burns, or someone else who's a little bit less aggressive on a particular issue. And Biden always seems to be in the middle, not knowing which way to go, maybe because his mental, facilities doesn't allow that much critical thought on that many issues a day or something like that. Who knows? So Seymour Hersh says in this article that one of the last hurdles to overcome was at the very last minute, Joe Biden decided that maybe this was too much, that, this would be tied to the U.S. And of course, again, it's an act of terrorism, it's a crime, it's could be considered an act of war against Russia, blowing up their pipeline, especially since this was planned prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And wanted a longer time. So initially they're going to plant the explosives and then 2 days later have them detonate. So it ends up being about 3 weeks later that the detonation, the explosion, compared to when they were planted, I believe. And that is because of a demand made by Joe Biden. So I guess the one part of the article I was personally most skeptical about was the sophistication of the device used. They were apparently, place these devices in concrete, and then we're going to give off some kind of unique sonar signal that the devices would pick up, and that would, indicate that to the devices to detonate. And so, this seems like some wild technology to me, but Seymour Hersh does have quotes in the article from Theodore Postal, who is a MIT professor, I think, very well respected, although at times he has had to redo his, retweet some public statements that he's made, given new information or maybe just miscalculations that he made. But at the same time, he's also, contributed to some very important reporting in the past. And so I think that gives this story, and at least that piece of it, to me, additional credibility. That Postal wasn't like, no, this is, technology that doesn't exist. You can't set off a bomb this way. He seemed to think that it was very possible. So that is the Nord Stream article. Again, I guess I had to really eat my own words here. I remember when this happened, I again, very skeptical on this show. I said, I really don't think that the Americans, that the White House did it. It seems to be, really an anti-environmental move. It's a criminal move. And all these other issues. It hurts the Europeans. Is clearly just throwing a bone, to the U.S. gas industry, to, Texas and everything like that. And, Hersh actually ties that into his article and explains why, Ted Cruz's pressure was something that helped drive this decision, and how he was holding up all of Biden's foreign policy appointments and the spending bill for the Pentagon for this year, because he was upset that the Nord Stream pipelines were coming online and the Biden administration wasn't going to do anything about that. So this is big. This is a big story. Now, I got more news on Russia, but I do want to kind of get back into how I plan to do the show today. And I just want to start with breaking down Dave DeCamp's article on Biden's State of the Union address. I don't think it's worth doing any more of a dive into the State of the Union other than Dave's article, because there was so little discussion in Biden's in Biden's State of the Union on foreign policy. So in his State of the Union on Tuesday night, Biden said that the U.S. should win the competition with Beijing, and that should unite all of us. Before I came to office, the story was about how the People's Republic of China was increasing its power and America was falling in the world. Not anymore, the president said. I think all that is just stuff that he more or less made up on his own, or speechwriters did. Biden insisted that he made clear to the Chinese President Xi that he seeks competition, not conflict, but the president said he makes no apologies for the fact that the U.S. was investing in industries that will define the future, and that China's government is intent on dominating. Biden could say again that, we want competition and not conflict, but he keeps telling the Chinese that he's willing to go to war over Taiwan, building new military bases in a ring around China, and providing Taiwan with more weapons. He could tell Xi whatever he wants, but, the Chinese and Beijing certainly see the world through American actions, not Biden's rhetoric. And it certainly indicates that the U.S. is preparing for conflict with China. Part of Biden's strategy to compete with China is through harsh sanctions that intend to cripple China's semiconductor industry. As part of this effort, his administration is pressuring Japan and the Netherlands to also limit chip exports to China. In the speech, Biden said to compete with China, the U.S. was investing in our alliances and working with our allies to protect our advanced technologies so they are not used against us. He said the U.S. is modernizing its military safeguards, stability, and to deter aggression. The address came a few days after the U.S. shot down a Chinese balloon over the Atlantic Ocean after it passed through the United States. I still can't get over that the U.S. shot down a weather balloon with an F-22, but this is what we're dealing with. Beijing insists it was a weather balloon, while Washington says it was a spy balloon. Secretary of State Antony Blinken canceled his trip to China over the incident. Made no mistake, as we made clear this week, if China threatens our sovereignty, we will act to protect our country, and we did, Biden said of the balloon incident. And let it be clear that winning the competition with China should unite all of us. I'm not sure how he claims he protected American sovereignty by allowing the balloon to fly all the way across the U.S. before shooting it down. But again, just putting out words that are, tend to indicate that he's anti-China. The president made little mention of the war in Ukraine besides platitudes about standing up for vague principles. Putin's invasion has been a test for the ages, a test for America, a test for the world. Would we stand up for our most basic principles, he said. Biden recognized the Ukrainian ambassador was in attendance but didn't say her name. And it seemed that he just forgot her name, but it's always difficult to tell with Biden. Overall, his speech would focus very little on foreign policy. All right, so now I want to move on and talk a little bit about the situation in Turkey and Syria. There was a devastating earthquake as of this morning. That's February 8th. The death toll on most, the mainstream sites, which is what I tend to use for this. If sometime later a different source puts out a study on the death toll, I'll certainly look at it. But in the immediate aftermath, these groups probably, like the AP, have the number as close as possible. They say that at this point they are estimating that 11,000 people have died in Turkey and Syria. So Dave's numbers are quite a bit off of that he has in this article, but it was a few days ago. So just want to read what Dave has here. After a devastating earthquake hit Syria and Turkey, killing thousands of people, the U.S. State Department showed no interest in lifting crippling sanctions on Syria that are specifically designed to prevent the country's reconstruction. So the Syrian Health Ministry said, and this was as of Monday, 711 people had died in government-controlled territories and areas controlled by the jihadists in Idlib province of Syria. This is the Turkish Ba'ath mostly, but in general, the Western Ba'ath, Al-Qaeda groups in Syria. That there's over 700 deaths in that region as well. The State Department spokesperson Ned Price said Monday that the U.S. would work with NGOs in the country, but wouldn't engage with the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. He didn't give any indication that the U.S. would lift specific sanctions on Syria. When asked by antiwar.com if the Biden administration is considering lifting sanctions, the State Department referred to Price's comments about working with NGOs. In Turkey, we have a partner in the government. In Syria, we have a partner in the form of NGOs on the ground who are providing humanitarian support, Price said. When pressed on why the U.S. wouldn't engage with Damascus, Price said, "It's quite ironic, if not even counterproductive, for us to reach out to a government that has brutalized its own people over the course of dozens of years now." Price claimed that there is no other country that has done more than the U.S. to provide aid to the Syrian people, but U.S. sanctions on Syria have a devastating impact on the civilian population, a UN rapporteur recently detailed in a report after visiting the country. According to Al Jazeera, the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, ADC, a U.S.-based advocacy group, called on Monday for the immediate lifting of U.S. sanctions on Syria. Lifting of sanctions will open the doors for additional supplemental aid that will prevent immediate relief to those in need. U.S. sanctions have impeded relief after earthquakes in the past. In June 2022, an earthquake in Afghanistan killed over 1,000 people, and UN officials said sanctions were complicating aid deliveries, but U.S. sanctions on Afghanistan remained and are still in effect today, despite U.S. warnings that 6 million Afghans are facing the risk of famine. So again, the U.S., we have to sanction Syria because Assad is brutal to his own people. Well, right now we're going to let thousands of Syrian people die and make sure that sanctions, continued and, not to be able to reach those people. You also have to wonder how many more lives would have been saved if reconstruction materials could have reached Syria over the past 3 years since the Caesar-ad sanctions were put in place. And or over the past 10 or 11 years, since the U.S. has essentially, prevented any Western country from doing any kind of reconstruction in Syria. So we have growing calls to lift sanctions now. The head of the Syria Arab Red Crescent on Tuesday called for the lifting of U.S. and other Western economic sanctions on Syria following a massive earthquake that, as this writing, Dave says, had killed over 7,000 people. But I said, as of this morning, I think we're at 11,000. The evacuation, processing, rescue operations are restricted due to obstacles resulting from severe sanctions. The president of SARC said, the sanctions are preventing Syria from acquiring machinery needed to rescue people from the rubble. I mean, specific machinery that lifts rubble without injuring trapped people under the rubble. The economic sanctions imposed on our country is the main obstacle to getting this machinery, he said. With this, we demand for the lifting of economic sanctions and the siege in order to allow aid deliveries and humanitarian actions to be implemented by the SARC and other bodies, he said. He appealed specifically to the European Union to lift sanctions and asked that the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, for humanitarian assistance. These sanctions are against the Syrian people, he said. The SARC operates in government-controlled territories, but he said they're willing to cross into areas of Idlib that are mainly controlled by Tahrir al-Sham, who is an al-Qaeda-led group. If parties agree to open the crossing, we are currently ready to send a convoy through the cross lines into Idlib. In the wake of the earthquake, there are growing calls for sanctions on Syria to be lifted. This is from the Middle East Council of Churches, a group representing Catholic, Orthodox, and cryptic Christians in the region. We urge the immediate lifting of sanctions on Syria, allowing access to all materials so sanctions not turn into a crime against humanity. And it's no surprise that the U.S. isn't going to lift sanctions. The point of sanctions is to make the situation in a country so intolerable for the people that so many people are dying, like the situation in Iraq where you have hundreds of thousands of children starving to death. That's what they want in Syria. They want every family to have one of their children starve to death because they think that will make those people go out in the streets and overthrow their own government. And so an earthquake to them isn't a catastrophe that must be responded to. It's an opportunity to further punish the Syrian people, push them further into poverty, and ensure, well, not in their eyes, ensure that Assad's overthrown. And really, it won't have that effect because people aren't stupid and they know who's, really responsible for their suffering right now. And honestly, it's not Assad. It's, the American government preventing reconstruction in their country. Now, the U.S. doesn't mind sending things to Syria. U.S. ramps up operations against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. U.S. Central Command last week announced it was involved in 43 operations against ISIS in Iraq and Syria in the month of January. Task and Purpose reported the average for U.S. operations against ISIS in 2022 was 26 per month, signaling the U.S. military is stepping up its assaults against the terror group. While ISIS no longer controls any territory, there are remnants of the group in remote ranges of Syria and Iraq. CENTCOM said Each raid in January was conducted with partner forces, the government in Iraq and the Kurdish-led SDF in Syria. The command said that the operations in both countries, 11 suspected ISIS operatives were killed and 227 were detained. CENTCOM did not offer any information on possible civilian casualties, how it knew who's ISIS and who doesn't, or any other, worthy questions asking these operations. Nope, we just got some ISIS guys. That's all we're going to say. And also, we don't have to be carrying out, particularly in Syria. The U.S. does not have to be involved in these anti-ISIS operations. The Syrian government is capable of doing it. The U.S. is preventing the Syrian government from reestablishing control over its own territory and cleaning up its own Islamic State problem. All right, just a couple more articles on the war in Ukraine before we wrap up here. This one I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on February 7th. Ukraine will receive 200 German-made battle tanks. Several North Atlantic Treaty Organization members have pledged to send over 200 Leopard series main battle tanks to Ukraine. However, much of the armor will not see the war zone for years. On Tuesday, Berlin announced they had reached an agreement with the Netherlands and Denmark to provide 178 Leopard 1 tanks to Kiev. Germany and Poland have previously agreed to send over 24 of the more modern Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, and so this does put the total number of Leopard series tanks to over 200. However, it will take time before the tanks can reach the battlefield. The Leopard 1 units have been decommissioned and must be modified before they could be sent to Ukraine, though the donor nations say they hope to send a total of 178 tanks. Some of the old Leopards may be too damaged to repair. Ukraine's defense minister said he envisions 20 to 25 of the tanks by this summer, about 80 by the end of the year, and more than 100 Leopard 1 tanks by 2024. That number is actually higher than the number the European countries proposed, so I'm not sure where he's planning on getting the other Leopard 1s, but that's just a statement from Ukraine. Ukrainian President Zelensky thanked the three countries for their weapons, but still demanded more. The tank coalition can really give us parity on the battlefield. It is necessary to understand that it depends on time, the quality, and the modernity of the tanks and the equipment. An announcement that some EU states would supply Leopard 1s to Ukraine was expected after Berlin approved the transfer of an unknown number of tanks last week. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz recently approved the transfer of 14 newer Leopard 2 made battle tanks to Ukraine. The decision was a reversal for Scholz, who ultimately failed to resist pressure to send the advanced weapons. NZZ, a Swiss outlet, reported that the German decision to send the Leopard 2s was made because Washington authorized the transfer of 31 M1 Abrams tanks to Kiev before succumbing to the demands from within the NATO bloc. Scholz said he defended his refusal to provide the tanks by worrying that such an escalation in military aid could provoke direct clash between Moscow and the West. The State Department approves a $10 billion sale of HIMARS rocket systems to Poland. The State Department on Tuesday notified Congress that it approved a potential sale of $10 billion in rocket launchers to Poland as the U.S. and European allies continue to ramp up their military spending. The deal includes 18 high-mobility artillery rocket system HIMARS rocket launchers that the U.S. has been providing Ukraine. They are made by Lockheed Martin, the principal contractor of the sale. The sale also includes ammunition for the HIMARS, including Army Tactical Missile Systems, ATACMS, which have a range of up to 190 miles, and guided multiple launch rocket systems, which can hit targets about 50 miles away. One of the interesting things here is anytime you have weapons going to Poland, you do have to wonder if they're maybe ultimately going to be funneled to Ukraine, or if giving these weapons to Poland will open up the Polish government to send maybe some older weapons or something like that to Ukraine. Republicans pressure Biden to send more advanced weapons to Ukraine. Key Republican members of Congress are launching a two-front campaign to pressure Biden to send more advanced weapons. Defense One reported citing people familiar with the plan, and I'm not surprised by this. I guess we ran some articles on antiwar.com, particularly one by David Stockman, where he says don't expect much from the Republicans now that they're in charge of Congress, and this is why. Then just two more quick stories here. UN chief fears Russia-Ukraine conflict could turn to wider war, and we essentially had the same thing being said by a Russian official. It's time to start to figure out ways how to de-escalate this conflict. No more advanced weapons. Let's figure out how to unwind this war, and that needs to be the solution. Although there's a fantastic article out in the New York Times this week. Christopher Cladwell, I believe, is the author, and he basically just argues that, look, Ukraine and Russia have incentive to end this war. The West doesn't, and that's what's preventing the war from ending. Much the same thing I've been saying on this show for over a year now. Anyways, thank you all so much for tuning in. I'll be back with more shows later in the week.